Today I'm going to paint my Necron Deathmarks and Immortals that I converted with the Wargame Exclusive Conversion sets. These guys have cloaks and this is going to be fun. It's coming right up.
Necrons!
Nick speaking and welcome to this video. Right, today I'm painting my Necron Immortals and Deathmarks which I converted with the Wargame Exclusive Conversion sets. These guys are really cool and of course, yes, they have cloaks. Now if this video inspires you to go out and buy these conversion sets from Wargame Exclusive, which I do highly recommend, then I would also highly recommend that you watch my build video first. It's linked up in the description below. For now though, hit the like button and let's get these guys painted. So of course I primed them black and I didn't glue these guys onto the base to help the painting process. I just thought it would be easier to get into the nooks and crannies that way. First up, I dry brushed the minis with Iron Breaker and I did this all over with the exception of some areas on the guns that I knew would be black. Dry brushing is a really simple technique. You just put some paint onto your brush, you take it off using a tissue or a cloth, and then you just gently dry brush over the miniature. The paint goes onto the raised areas and the recesses stay black. This process is so simple that you don't even need to wash the miniatures because the recesses stay black from the dry brushing. Now regarding the cloaks or robes that these guys are wearing, of course, not many Necrons have robes. Obviously, some of the characters do, and the theme of my Necron army is a character with a robe just gets the robe painted in a nice bright colour to distinguish them from the rest of the miniatures. Maybe a blue, a purple, a red. Each model can have a different coloured robe. That's how my army works. However, these guys are a little different. It's a standard unit, it's not a character, and obviously the whole unit has them. So I needed to work out what colour I was going to paint these cloaks. Now, the cloaks themselves have holes in them all over the cloak. They're sort of fairly torn and worn, let's say. And at this stage, I didn't really know how I was going to paint the cloaks, to be honest. So what I decided to do was go into all of the holes and just paint them silver so that when you looked through the hole you'd be able to see the silver body underneath. Now it's fair to say that I don't keep this theme on the cloaks because as I paint the cloaks I sort of realise other things. But at this stage I didn't know this, so I continued to paint all of the holes silver as well as obviously the armour itself. Once I'd done the Iron Breaker all over, I moved on to more dry brushing but with a rune fang still. And again, I just went over everything that I'd already painted silver with this colour. It just gave me the extra depth to the colour and obviously increased the intensity of the metal. Because I'm dry brushing, I don't get a full colour of metal over the miniatures. I get a sort of mottled, worn metal look, which I really like for my Necrons. I was copying the pictures in the 3rd edition codex when I first started my army back in 2001, quite a long time ago now. And the Immortals were supposed to be more battle worn than the rest of the units. And to copy those pictures, to get the Immortals to look more worn, I went on to this, the next stage, and that was to dry brush black on the inner areas of the metal. Now, of course, there were no washes back then, or there was inks, but no washes, and there was no YouTube tutorials on how to paint things, so I just made things up. But it worked really well. Now, of course, these sculpts don't have too much metal work, so I just did this on some of the bigger areas, just to make the Immortals look a little bit more worn, like my original Immortals were. I didn't do this for the Deathmarks because, of course, they're not supposed to be as worn. After I dry brushed with black, I just got the Runefang Steel again, and I just lightly dry brushed over the edges, just to enhance the edges and make them look a little sharper. Right, let's talk about painting these cloaks. Now these cloaks I was very interested in painting because they have an etching on the cloaks, a sort of criss-crossy sort of pattern from the 3D printing. Now, not because the 3D printer wasn't very good, but because they're there on purpose to help them look like cloth. So I was very interested to paint these. However, I needed to work out what colour to paint them. Now, the way I looked at this, especially for the Deathmarks, because for me the Deathmarks, being snipers, potentially would be hidden in terrain. Yes, I know they can deep strike now, etc. But they're a sniper unit. They're going to be generally sort of camped up in terrain. I thought it might be a good idea to paint the cloaks as if they were doing that. So what I decided to do is go to my old Necron terrain colours, my original Necron terrain colours, and paint them exactly the same as I paint my terrain, so that they get this camouflage look on my table. Of course, I've got a second Necron board now, which is a different colour to my original Necron terrain, but I thought my original Necron terrain would make more sense because I've got lots of debris on some of my older bases which are painted to my old Necron terrain colour. Then I thought it would be the ideal colour. So I started to paint these cloaks. First of all, base coating with Caliban green. The paint is thinned with some water, so I knew I would have to do 2 or 3 coats of this colour just to build up the colour. And I started painting them, leaving the holes not painted, like I explained earlier. However, as I painted the cloaks, I realised actually these robes are sort of made of 2 layers. So there was an under layer and then an over layer, but of course they were sort of intertwined quite a bit. And what I noticed, of course, is some of the holes weren't over the body at all. So I painted those with Caliban green, just filled them in. And also some of the holes were on the outer layer. So in my mind, there was the under layer, of course, underneath that outer layer. So I painted those with Caliban green as well. Actually, I didn't leave too many holes in the end, silver, only the ones which were clearly on the bottom layer of this cloak, where you would definitely see some Necron body underneath it. My first coats with this colour were with a larger brush, and then I got a smaller brush, went into the holes, and of course went onto the edges of the cloak as well. Just made sure the whole of the cloak was painted, trying my best not to spill over onto the silver. However, I knew when it came to highlighting this, I was going to be a little messy with my highlights because, as always, we're doing a nice easy paint scheme here. I'm going to dry brush the highlights. Okay, so highlighting the cloak, exactly the same colours as I do my terrain. Dry brushing first with Warpstone green. Just dry brushing the cloak pretty much all over because there's quite a few raised areas and because of the etching on the cloak. I've got a really nice sort of natural highlight with this colour. I then moved on to a mute green. Now with this colour I was a little bit more particular, making sure that I only did the raised areas and also imagining the light coming down from the top. So I was a little bit more meaningful with these highlights where they were going. But still very simple, just dry brushing. Now, of course, I was as careful as possible when dry brushing not to get it onto the silver. I used a brand new dry brush so that the hairs weren't too splayed. I did my best to make sure that it didn't go onto the silver, but of course it did here and there. So I had to touch up this, and I'm used to this. I do a lot of dry brushing. So what I did to touch up the silver is I actually used Ironbreaker and I watered it down a little bit. So rather than using the Runefang Steel, I'm using Ironbreaker, and the reason for that is when you actually paint this on, rather than dry brush it on, you get a very similar colour to the Runefang Steel. So yeah, I just got the paint and I just painted it over, just very thinly, just building up 2 or 3 layers over any areas that had some green on it. Okay, so next I went to the Tesla weapons on my Immortals, because that's the weapon that I chose to use, and I painted Caliban green on the energy tubes of that weapon. I did look at my original Deathmarks and Immortal models just to see how I'd painted them, where all the green was, to give me a guide to painting these ones, because I want the miniatures to match my army. I used Warpstone green to base coat all of the wires and the orbs that I wanted green. It's best to thin down the paint and do 2 or 3 coats with this colour just to build up the colour, rather than painting straight from the pot and just doing one thick colour. The finish just looks much better if you do more coats with thinner paints. Once that was done, I highlighted all of the green with mute green, just leaving the original Warpstone green in the recesses. Regarding the energy sections on the Deathmarks gun, I just blocked in this highlight colour just in the centre of that energy weapon, because my plan was to blend those energy weapons just to take the quality of the painting for that particular section of the gun to the next level, and that will help finish the miniature off and maybe make it look better painted than it actually is, because like I said, I'm using really basic techniques, but increasing the quality on that wire for that weapon really helps the model go to the next level. Now I've got quite a few painting tutorials which I've linked in the description below, one of them on wet blending, but I'll just give you a quick basic rundown of how I did it here. So I got Warpstone green and mute green thinned down on my wet palette, and then I painted the Warpstone glow on the outside edge of the wire, and then I got the mute green and I painted it on the mute green area in the centre, and then I took all the paint off of my brush and I just feathered the brush on the area in the middle where the join is to try and, well, basically pull those 2 paints together. Now you may have to do this 2 or 3 times before you start to get a nice blend, but as you do it, it will quickly become a nice blend. Now there are 2 other techniques that you could use for this. One is a little bit easier than what I'm doing. That's dry blending, where you effectively have 1 wet paint and you just sort of, well, drag the paint over the dry paint. It's a little bit easier than 2 wet paints together. But also you could go 1 step further than I'm doing here with what's called glazing, where you use very thin paints and you do many layers, almost like dry blending, but with really thin paints. I like wet blending. I find it's the easiest to do with the best results without too much time. Again, I've got videos linked in the description below if you want to find out more about these painting techniques. Okay, so then I got my black paint and I just touched up all of the areas that I wanted to be black. I have a lot of black on my guns. I think it gives a nice contrast to the silver on the bodies. So yeah, I just got my black paint and I just touched up anything that I wanted black on these models. At this stage I felt I was ready to glue these onto the bases, so that's what I did, just got some super glue and glued them onto the base. I then highlighted my black with a light dry brush of lead Boucher, and I say light because it is light. I want my guns to be black. I don't want to dry brush them with silver and turn them into silver, so it's a really light dry brush just on a few of the edges, just to give the guns a little highlight, maybe a little battle damage. I then painted gold on the collarbones and the symbol of the Immortals, just like my original Immortals have. It's a slightly different design, but I just put some gold just on the front of the collar, and like I said, on the little symbol on the chest plate. It matches them in really nicely. And then it was time to paint the thing which I was actually dreading painting. The thing that scared me the most about painting these miniatures. Maybe the thing that I should have painted first, but didn't, and that's the faces, because my Immortals and my Deathmarks have white faces. I don't mind painting white faces, that's not a problem. However, these faces are quite well hidden in the cloaks. I used Skull White, I watered it down, I did many coats, around 5 or 6 coats, and I just built up the colour very carefully, trying not to get it onto what I'd already painted. With half of the faces missing, I just picked out the areas which I could see the most on the models. It worked out perfectly in the end. I didn't really have any issues. I then got some PVA glue and glued sand onto the base. I painted the sand black. I then got some rocks from my garden and I painted them in my Necron terrain colours. I then dry brushed the sand on the base with Dawnstone Grey. I painted the rims of the base with black and glued on the rocks. And we are done. I'm really happy with these miniatures and how they came out. I think they're going to be an awesome addition to my army. And the fact that I've managed to use all of the spares, the leftover bits from the Immortal and Deathmarks kits that I had in my bits box with these miniatures is fantastic. And these miniatures actually, whilst they are designed for Immortals and Deathmarks, they can be used for lots of other stuff as well, including Lichguard. If you have some Lichguard arms left over, then these bodies will work really well for conversions for those models as well. Now regarding the cloaks, I'm really happy how they came out. They were a lot of fun to paint. The etching on the cloaks came out really well with that dry brushing, and I like the fact that I painted them like my terrain. I think it matches my army really well. I've had quite a few people comment that they would actually paint them as if they were skin, like flayed ones, and I think that would work well. I think you probably would need to maybe green stuff some extra material on the arms just to really make it look like skin more than an actual robe or cloak. I'd be very interested to hear how you painted these cloaks, or how maybe you plan to paint these cloaks. Now I've also painted an urban camouflage cloak for a commission that I did, and I'll link that video up for you to watch just there. You may also enjoy watching the conversion video about building these miniatures, because if you're planning to get these miniatures, I'd highly recommend you watch that conversion video before you do.